Hello everyone, today we talk about the Landsknechts, or the Landsknechte, or Landsknechte, because the name was modified as we will see over time. So this very famous early modern Renaissance, as a matter of fact, German mercenary corps in a sense, because the Landsknechts, as we will see now, had properly a status within the empire, and their name, that again we will see etymologically now, really explains better from a cultural point of view than anything, and their military history, their lifestyle, also more, which in fact represents, it definitely incarnates a bit the even more than the Swiss, even more than other famous mercenaries of the early modern age, about which we made several videos, also highlighting the multinationality in Europe, right? In this moment in which Europe was really coming together even in the market of war, you could find really very multinational armies, etc. And that, again, better than anyone else, incarnates the Renaissance mercenary. And if you want, the negative bias attached to it, right? With the name of the Landsknechts, we associate normally the violent, ruthless, cruel, but also gaudy lifestyle. The elaborate clothes, this majestic and arrogant appearance, right? Of this, beefy, tall man that spread terror and fought stereotypically with its Zweihänder and more. Naturally, the Landsknechts were easily recognizable on a battlefield, even from a great distance. As a matter of fact, they did instill fear, but their history is very big. It has a meaning that, if you want, encompasses a bit all the controversial and even incoherent and somehow paradoxal aspects of the Renaissance whirlwind, of the destruction of the universal order, of the sense of dazzlement, of disorientation that eventually was incarnated by the Baroque era, rather, where the Landsknechts definitely had declined, as we will see, and new orders were being affirmed, and they're a bit the litmus test of the political and social, rather than just military, situation of the Holy Roman Empire from the end of the Middle Ages to, in fact, fundamentally the 30 Years' War, when the imperial soldiers naturally existed, but in fact were called as such, not Landsknechts anymore. And even though there were other famous armies at the time, mostly, as we know, the battlefields were dominated by the tercio at this point, by the Spanish standard, which the same Landsknechts at some point were compared, previously also the Swiss ones, of which the Landsknechts were, as eventually all the type of Pike&Shot troops eventually inspired from, at least modeled on. They were the Landsknechts were quite peculiar from a strictly identitary, organizational, and somehow also background point of view, right? The particularities of which we will address partially today. This is just an introductory video. I already made, telling the truth, one about properly the Landsknechts clothes, that, as you know, are one of the most, in fact, the most distinguishing feature, at least in this pre-uniform period, where in fact the Landsknechts actually embodied already much more heterogeneous style than the one that was being affirmed in fact, more homogeneous way, and that strongly actually stemmed from their spirit, peculiarity, and role with also their employers, that were in fact the Holy Roman emperors. And from the point of view of military history, although the Landsknechts parable lasted only a century, they are remembered rightfully, in the sense, as such a singular, as crucial phenomenon for the influence that their militia had, also in the formation of modern armies, even though they fundamentally failed themselves in evolving toward that direction. That was, in fact, contrary to their esprit de corps, in a way, and also, of course, because of the context that wouldn't bring to a major reform to make them, again, take next step. The Habsburgs, we've seen it often in the videos about Montecuccoli and Prince Eugene, took a while before developing a professional standing army, just like mostly like in the Grand Siècle, France had pioneered first in Europe, but they, in a way, were much more connected with the not necessarily the traditional ideal per se, but the traditional order, right, and what it was meant to embody, especially in a country like Germany. In this, again, Europe was awakening to a new reality, the reality of the loss of a center. With the Protestant Reformation, it was by far the single most traumatic event for Europeans in the 16th century. We stress, because of course historiography diminishes the religious importance for ideological reasons, but the discovery of the new world was nothing in comparison, right? It's not true that Europeans were particularly shocked by this event, considering what was actually happening in Europe, for not talking about the Ottoman onslaught, right? And a lot of other internal dynamics that were deeply important to this individual, so from a strictly political and even social point of view. So consider that at the end of the 15th century, between the sunset of the Middle Ages and the first light of the Renaissance, Europe was notoriously not a peaceful continent, but rather troubled by a very high level of conflict. And this aspect is often, misunderstood in the sense that the Renaissance is normally attributed, a positive idea, right? Or at least that at the time there was some sort of feeling of the coming out of the darkness or whatever. We often forget that aside from the ultra-elitistic humanistic circles that were also serving the most Uranic Apollonian driven rulers of the time, that in the Ancien regime that now had fundamentally been crystallizing, were by far actually above the reality of the masses that were actually in fact locked until the end of the modern age itself. Then this time wasn't perceived at all, but openly, notoriously, explicitly, for anybody who knows the literature of the time, etc., as a moment of somehow of happiness, of positive affirmation or expansion. It was actually a century devoured by anxiety, by darkness, by the sense of impending doom, right? And aside from this formal aesthetic aspects of course, stemming from the recovery of the classical past and the beauty and especially the forms of the Greek and Roman civilizations, was actually the expression still of medieval civilization, and that had actually always been based on the classical antiquity by an important degree, right? Culturally, scientifically, morally, artistically, and so on. And that was actually taking a huge step forward, right? After what had been actually a great phase of contraction, this is true, so there was definitely a growth. There was definitely an extension of, even considering, in fact, the same geographical boundaries. But these were not like a progressive, optimistic path led by, the governments, whatever. It was actually an extremely painful labor, right? That the wars of the early 16th century, yes, with this new means, with the new acquisitions of the art of war, Pike&Shot tactics, about which we made, and strategy, by the way, what that entailed up to the political level. There is a playlist I made. Those topics we periodically revisit. Was actually bringing, in fact, an enormous amount of distraction, right? The systems, as we've seen, were ever more intertwined, and of course they lacked a previous kind of safety net, right, to preserve from massive distractions as well, right? There were entire regions of Europe that were ravaged, that were turned into frontiers. There were enormous economical imbalances, also demographic ones. In the face of, say, a political and institutional side that was still not fully in control by the standards were habituated now, essentially affirmed after centuries of this continuous warfare and this continuous need of, first of all, this struggle for survival, right? But and especially this enormous effort, negotiation with the communities to create something more stable, more permanent, that could provide with the standards for reasonable internal pacification that were habituated today, and bringing the things even to other levels. So this existential anxiety was actually very alive at the time, and for not talking about the passions morally, religiously, also nationally by a degree, but still within a mindset that was fundamentally universal, right? There was nothing teleological about most of these changes. Some of them were very contingent, even some of the most crucial, important ones, right? The same Reformation was essentially a mistake of both the Catholics and the Protestants that decided to misunderstand each other, that let go away the greatest opportunity to maintain actually a universal rule, and fundamentally bent their religious policies to and biblical exegesis and further to their own interests in many ways. And so we can measure in this collapse of the previous traditional order also the energy liberation following the decay, just like when an atom is split, and that we can say the same mercenaries, such as the Landsknechts, but others as well, the ones that were so infamous in early modern Europe, embodied, right? Wild forces liberated from a destructuring order that was ever more bent to the degree of relativistic ideologism that we have been continuing to experience till to this day. But again, still deeply mixed with traditionals, imbued with traditional sense, values, and so the ability also to see themselves as not just as mercenaries, but in the case of the Landsknechts especially, a sort of core within the feudal hierarchy of the Holy Roman Empire, which we will see in a while, because the Middle European cultural dimension is very often confused. Like, people like to stereotype a lot what many countries in Europe really are, especially from an external perspective. But a huge part missing of European appreciation is the existence of a properly Central European reality, which is not Northern European, which is not Western European. It's Central European, right? People are fundamentally obsessed either with the divide between West and East, or the one between North and South. But Europe is something actually making exceptions continuously to this kind of axis, and even when they're so deeply intertwined in ways that you cannot ignore also these other internal macrocultural areas that really were a different world compared to others. Just think about, again, the difference that existed in the mindset of a Landsknecht compared to the one of a tertio soldier, right? Or what was the Swiss mentality, or the one of the Italian condottieri. They were the product of different political and social systems that thus were reflected also from a military point of view. So on Schwerpunkt, I made multiple videos about the Burgundian army, recently also about the Swiss one, There are two playlists for each topic, and I plan to discuss this further, of course, because we can say within there began properly, even if there are several videos per each. But it's within that clash that much of, as you know, the Habsburgic creation of the Landsknechts followed. The war between the Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, and the Swiss Confederation was basically wanted by Charles, right, also as a strategic political direction that revealed itself to be detrimental eventually against the Swiss, but that also liberated eventually with the death of Charles, and thus also the disintegration of the Burgundian state, the arch enemies like the same France, from which Burgundy had stamped, as you know, to in fact incorporate the same Duchy of Burgundy that had to that point, as I have explained in the historical region video about Burgundy, had always preserved a great autonomy, and that that made the same Habsburgs also capitalizing, especially with the acquisition of the Netherlands, right? The marriage between the heiress, the daughter of Charles, and Maximilian the First of Habsburg, Holy Roman Emperor. So a series actually of coincidences, as most history is, but in that case, pretty much so from a dynastic, biological point of view. If Charles had not died, if the marriage, if France had not decided to invade Burgundy, if I don't know, for whichever reason Maximilian had died before marriage, the entire history of the world would have been different. And from a strictly military point of view, that war had really impressed the contemporaries, because from one side you had the Burgundian ordinance that we have described, in fact, as one of the single most advanced armies in Europe at the time, together with the Venetian Condotta. Fundamentally, these were the best that, in a sense, we can say with some approximation, feudal Europe had began to, to increase military power by medieval standard scales. And again, instead, as we've seen also recently, after all, very simple Swiss model that didn't derive from any particular, let's say, elaboration from a tactical point of view. The Burgundian ordinances were a traditional mix of how all armies in Europe had been up to that point: knights, some supporting mounted retinue, pikemen, crossbowmen, longbowmen, firearms, etc. The Swiss basically had just pikemen. Right, they had a minimal, shot and bow, but fundamentally their entire military formula was based on a hyper training, right? On that at a scale of thousands of pikemen at a time that were essentially to advance without losing order in order to offend the enemy, even cavalry, right? And something that medieval infantry fundamentally had never done in an offensive sense, right? All the medieval armies that had managed to withstand cavalry charges had done so by being very well entrenched in their own positions in a defensive way. Some had counterattacked, of course, but very often risking annihilation, because nobody had ever trained them en masse. Switzerland had been growing with an important population, had decided to put in common a certain amount of resources from the mid-15th century, and they realized that pikemen were essentially the future. They increased dramatically their ration within the army, where there were still lots of halberdiers, and those are not really anti-cavalry or anti-knight, successfully speaking, weapons, because essentially the greatest Swiss victories had been somehow ambushes, right? So exploiting not much the quality of the arms, but the terrain, leadership, morale, and so on. And after the Battle of Arbedo, where the Knights of the Carmagnola had dismounted and taken on the Swiss halberdiers with their own men-at-arms lances, right, and inflicting this important defeat on the cantons, the Confederacy had decided to create this bulk, right, of pikemen, because if you don't have thousands of pikemen, these are practically useless because you can't turn around them. You don't have this block that is supposed to stop also an enemy battle from the front, and training them in such a fashion to be able not to lose again formation and to beat also the enemy on time, right, in drill, in discipline, in order, cohesion. And thus, if you look actually at the Burgundian, the repeated Burgundian defeats during the wars against the Swiss, you realize that yes, the Swiss had really pushed forward, but that they had won mostly for things like, literally appearing from on the side of the enemy before he could even realize how fast that infantry could march, right? Because they were simply not habituated to that standard. You can't even properly and qualitatively blame, say, the Burgundian ordinances per se. It was just a completely different model that was eventually copied by all the other Europeans and spreading at that point and surpassing the same Swiss one that essentially remained a pike-based one, whereas other countries like France, Spain, even when using it at a point, these pikemen, for example, the French used mostly Swiss infantry, right? But they had very strong cavalry and artillery on their own. The Spanish, at some point under Charles V, they used the Landsknechts in the Iberian Peninsula themselves, but they were large states that could frame their armies in a kind of also much more extensive standard way for those times, average, let's say, and bringing forward, right, surpassing the same Swiss on the battlefields of the Italian wars, where the Landsknechts also proved themselves to be quite effective, sometimes against the Swiss that had become by that point, as we will see now, their greatest rivals, right, and that were almost basically the same people, because as far as the Swiss are concerned, we're talking about some sort of mountain Germans, right, that, in Tyrol, in Austria, etc., were of the same pace, but still framed within another political, institutional context. We'll see now. Burgundy at the time of the Swiss wars was also credited as being the most magnificent country in Europe, especially as far as the chivalric standards were concerned. If you actually look at how this sum of territories actually stretching between across France and the Holy Roman Empire had been put together, you realize there was not really a true political, cultural, national, or proto-national unity, right? So it was just their sort of feudal dynastic sum of possessions. That this probably had something to do with the way it disgregated differently from smaller countries that instead were more compact and would manage to even build over time, but on a more cohesive base through identitary sense. The same Netherlands, actually, given that we're talking about Burgundy and the Habsburgs, but also the same Switzerland. And what had made the ordinances so famous was definitely their cost, the attempt in uniformation, the important spread in artillery that Burgundy had with the largest park in Europe, even before France, chronologically speaking. Thus, a meticulous organization, an innovative hierarchical structure was trying to integrate essentially more, say, the feudal establishment with more professional troops and militias coming from this vast possession. And yet, against all odds, given that, again, the Burgundian army was strong, but don't necessarily judge on the basis of the fact they simply lost or the other failures, such as the siege of Neuss, that was mostly also a political problem, and at some point on the field also caused by accidents, as all military outcomes are, without exception, coast, but doesn't mean that there is not a merit, of course, from the Swiss side, as we were saying before at all, right? That they did have a lot for many reasons that I tried to explain that go even beyond the type of tactics or organization. Telling the truth, it's a moral thing. And what impressed mostly contemporaries at the time is that this magnificent army was defeated at the hands of an army of infantry made up of mere hillbillies or mountain billies, as the Swiss practically were. And as we've seen, you have to appreciate Switzerland even more in that regard, because Switzerland literally didn't have anything. Right, there are no resources. It's not like, and yet they became, as you know, among the true top richest peoples in Europe, literally from nothing. From nothing. The country has nothing per se. It's the people that made it happen. In many ways, it's just as, for example, the Dutch and other peoples that historically, from a very disadvantaged position, actually reached the top out of very often the same moral needs brought by that struggle. So Maximilian of Habsburg, that had been coping also with the Burgundians that had tried to invade the Rhine Valley and entering a bit properly the imperial affairs more directly, as future emperor, had inherited Burgundy, right, for having married Charles' daughter, and thus was, in a sense, to embrace the Burgundian legacy as far also as the lesson learned from this dramatic defeat was concerned. You know that Burgundy lived on in the Habsburgic territories, even the Spanish flag fundamentally inherited the Burgundian St. Andrew's cross. Later on, when the other marriage between Maximilian's son and the heiress of the Spanish crowns brought the Habsburgs to, in fact, collect this enormous amount of territories from Austria, Bohemia, Naples. In fact, all the Iberian possessions, except Portugal for a while at least, the Netherlands, some other territories in Central Europe, in northern Italy. So an enormous, yet very difficult to rule territory, and in fact chronically fragmented one that wouldn't make it to centralize from that base, and in which, in a sense, the Landsknechts are the military reflection of, as we will see now. Not much because they were actually a national corps of some sort, because they were properly a German thing within the same empire, but that reflect the still, especially as far as Central Europe was concerned, limited and in fact the difficulties in the political and institutional development, and that was in fact Maximilian's problem. At this point, all the most updated princes of Europe needed now armies that, as the Swiss-Burgundian wars had proven, couldn't be just the knightly ones, the feudal ones, right? Even though Germany was a very feudal country, because in the late Middle Ages had actually fragmented as at least compared to what the potential of the national monarchy in high medieval times could be, and in what we call, in fact, princely Germany from a historiographic point of view, because it was all these essentially 300 states, right, feudal states within a territory that had seen literally these dynasties taking over, also rurally, right? There was an important urbanization in some parts of Germany, but this never went politically or military beyond fundamentally the city walls, and these great princes of the countryside really lorded over and trying to monopolize this game of, as you know, what was for Central Europe at the time, like all countries, like also Bohemia, Hungary, Poland, an elective monarch, right? And thus an endless negotiation with this enormously complicated territory with great divides, with great differences. and that the Habsburgs, after a moment of relative eclipse in favor of especially of the Luxembourgs, etc., had managed to kind of top again, right, maintaining fundamentally the imperial title till the end, right, and managing to compact, in fact, this pretty sizable land mass, especially in southeastern Germany, so with Austria, Styria, Carniola, Carinthia, Tyrol, right, also actually Burgundy. For a while, at least they claimed their possession from the French. Still regions in the southwest of Germany, close to Switzerland, from which they had also been kicked out as their ancestral lands, plus this some of dynastic crown of Bohemia, of Silesia, of Hungary, especially after the destruction, as you know, of brought on the latter country by the Ottomans after Moach, the so-called Royal Hungary that passed to the Habsburgs. And thus with great interest especially in Italy, right? That was politically divided, but very rich, and that thus would trigger what we call the Italian Wars, because all these great countries that had unified, such as Spain, right, that had unified these enormous territories of Castile, Aragon, at the same France after the 100 Years' War, tried to struggle, right, to take the control of. Right? And thus, in this huge international competition, you needed professional armies, right? There was nothing truly permanent as far as these, especially large bodies of pikemen, as warfare had come to be now after the Swiss model, with essentially the important decisiveness of infantry over cavalry that had turned what the medieval trend really was, and it was especially pioneered by the Swiss initially with this mono-arm system, then by the Spanish at the Battle of Cerignola. It's Gonzalo de Cordoba that fundamentally manages to stop French cavalry charges with arquebusiers and pikemen and ditches and so on. And so everybody was kind of looking, especially at this early models, and at this time, especially in the 15th century, still the Swiss, after the Burgundian Wars, to say, look, we have to copy this. Now, the great problem of having an armored force of that kind is that it's enormously expensive, right? Infantry at that point has not just to be paid consistently, to be trained, to have this unitary corps, this satisfactory numbers to make the pike square in battle, plus other elements, of course, like arquebusiers and artillery, but you need to draw them from, again, a territory, from communities. That's the greatest problem of any modern ruler. You have to ask for these, not much demand, because you would always find the scum of the earth flocking, right, to be hired. The problem, you needed the money, right, to arm them, to train them, to keep them under. And given that there was no such thing like a contemporary state, yet a truly absolute one, here we are at the beginnings of that. As you know, there is an historiographical understanding, which is correct as long as you don't term it a revolution, for which you notice that these acquisitions in the art of war speeded up, accelerated the process of state building, right? The Habsburgs were some of the greatest, most powerful families in Europe, but as far as and especially they would become the first one with this Burgundian and Spanish marriages. But as far as their German territories were concerned, yes, they had a huge power, but still they had just after all, a huge influence, rather, a relatively contained land mass from which they had to attract troops, right, to be hired. And Maximilian was actually a far-sighted ruler, one of the shrewdest and most capable of the time, as you know. And he was definitely surrounded by various threats, starting from the same German princes, but also Hungary, also, the southern neighbors. The problem that Europe was, Central Europe was being threatened by the Ottoman advance. These territories, again, such as, the lowlands from the diametrically opposite side of the German kingdom. So what does have a Styrian to do with a Dutch, right? In that sense, the Habsburgs weren't liked at all, actually, in those territories. That went also for when just the Austrians were there, not more directly the Spanish from the later partitions would come. And even in there, say, retrospectively, we see the Netherlands eventually, because they made it after the 80 Years' War to be independent. But you have really to think that all territories that are under your control can potentially rebel in that fashion, right? So aside from the Austrian core land that was somehow also problematic to rule, but at least more loyal and more kind of towards a statal tendency, there were mostly the resistance of the princes of the empire to win. You could not talk about the Landsknechts if you don't talk about Maximilian's political, especially fiscal reforms in the empire, the creation of the Reichskammergericht. A lot of institutions were trying to surpass this heraldic forest that were trying to standardize to make especially tax flows more punctual, right? More stable, more frequent, so that you could finance these troops and consolidating your power forward. So today we try to make minimally military history, so we don't have time to digress on that, but always remember that that was the chronic problem. These dynasties were chronically out of money. They had to borrow from other systems. First, it was the Fugger, then it was St. George Bank in Genoa, and beyond. The Habsburgs, especially also the Spanish Empire, were actually quite rich, especially the latter, as far as think about all the precious metals of the Americas coming in. But still, the wars were continuous, and you needed contributions from the communities that, as a traditional ruler, you were just defending the rights on, not kind of imposing things on as a arbitrary authority, right? And so the early medieval battlefields are also the representation of this, right? And Maximilian realized that he could have not stayed afloat if he had not profoundly renewed his armed force, that even though was essentially, again, coming from, like it was normally in princely Germany from important private contributions, it also was the imperial army, right? At least it would come also from imperial contribution. And he realized from this Burgundian experience that the most updated models of the current military art had to do surely with the so-called Swiss model, right? But also, and this is perhaps overlooked, about not just the Middle Ages but also the modern age, still a virtue, right? Not pure just discipline from these Swiss that were literally, again, mountaineers. They were rough people without any kind of sophistication. Literally, even the same pike squares worked like the important was to be thickly packed, orderly together. Even the way they fought with a pike was extremely primitive, extremely unsophisticated. It had nothing to do with what, for example, a knightly training had to do. But of course, collective discipline was more important. But it still needed some, in fact, what the Romans would have called virtue, right? In a warlike religious fervor that the Germans, in that sense, could draw from, in fact, their princely estates, from the Teutonic Knights, from all these experiences that Germany had collected over the centuries as essentially a frontier country, right? Germany, especially in the east, doesn't really have a border. Think about the Mongol invasions, all these quarrels with the Bari. Think about the confessional wars, the Hussite ones we've seen also recently again, right? All military events that had somehow kept the German nobility well oiled and well, kind of, also for broader political social reasons, right? The fact that, of course, the nobility was in crisis, at least in the face of the rise of this other properly princely states, right? In fact, the relatively militarized reality, especially in the poorest areas that were full of kind of youth, and that especially with broader inflationary crises like the ones that were coming ever more frequently in these times, with wars, economical imbalances, political struggles, and so on, would ever more decide to become mercenaries. There was also, in this sense, actually a successful element of Maximilian's father-in-law, Charles, of Valois-Burgundy, that, as we've seen, was the organization and the hierarchy of, in fact, a mix of a nobiliar and a somehow commoner's army, imbued also with some professionalism of sort. So definitely Maximilian didn't lack the substance for putting together these forces. What was really costly, of course, was the form, but the form was also laid out by these new military accomplishments. And the Swiss corps was definitely the most precise model that the Habsburg took in consideration for especially the weapons, the way of fighting more generally. That was to become standard in a few years, at least as far as the infantry was concerned. The men of the Swiss Confederacy, that, as we've seen, had emerged just as the arch enemies of the Habsburgs, because they had literally dislodged them from their part of their ancestral lands, had already made themselves known, not just for their tactics per se, but from a bit more of a political and cultural point of view, for their combativeness, right? This was evident again in those victories scored over the Austrians in the 14th century, and since the first half of the 15th, as we've seen, the Swiss had adopted the 4-5 meters long pike as their main weapon, right? Pikes had always been there, also because they are the single and only an exclusive type of weapon that can stop cavalry charges. Halberds do not do this. Crossbows do not do this, right? And the halberd at best is good at offending the knight when the charge has stopped, right? And you can use it as a can opener, right? Especially also while the knight is still on horseback, but also when you throw him down and you ground him. But the pike swings is difficult to use in formation without a adequate collective training. So that, as we've seen, had been the main Swiss accomplishment. The fame of the Reisläufer, that is to say, literally those who go to war, right? Those who participate to the Reisen, to the expeditions intended literally as a military journey. That's how the Swiss cantons contributed literally with their quota of troops for the wars that the Confederacy had to undertake, had already presented kind of a model of, if you want, of mercenarism, because there is really no difference between a mercenary and a soldier. Like, the concept is just a bit biased per se, just it's a soldier who receives a pay, and actually mercenaries very often, in terms of cost-benefit ratio, some of the most reliable forces around. That's why they were used, and they were the top elements before the creation of permanent standing statile armies, we can say, in the 17th century. So given that the Habsburgs ruled on southern Germany, on part of the Alps, from the other side of the Swiss ones, let's say, but they had somehow similar manpower as far as this cultural, social background was concerned, right? Um, Arguably, this had already begun, right? Lots of Germans had been mercenaries since the crisis of the Ministeriales in the late Middle Ages. Um, Italy was a very important military school for them. They had always served in important numbers abroad. So again, the idea of from the more primitive areas of Europe to go where the money is and who can pay you for fighting in his stead already had a pretty sizable market of international proportions, especially it was beginning at this time to be so all across Europe. And the reason also why this profession had skyrocketed, aside from, of course, the economical availability, the fact the states were building up and so they could invest, they had the means of investing more money, was that naturally there were a lot of kind of pretty wild, ruthless, and brutal people out there that just lived like that. I mean, if you can't understand even Swiss combativeness if you don't understand how tough this men were living in the highest places in Europe, constantly struggling against nature, being somehow fit, resilient. Right, this is something that why did the Italians use, for example, the condottieri and this mostly mercenary troops in a contained fashion, because mostly they had gentrified. They were merchants. They also had somehow small states, not a national kind of scale of political, of military involvement, let's say. So Maximilian in this regard had a bit both of things in a kind of a hybrid way. A bit of the money deriving from probably the imperial role, that's also kind of a nationwide kind of, authority. Even doesn't matter how just nominal it was in most Germany, but also controlling directly, as the Habsburg possessions could, some mountaineer regions. And thus it was somehow possible to put together, with important efforts and also the supports of some noblemen and or Swiss contractors that had to teach how to fight in the Pike Square, etc., an armed force that could become the effectively violent arm of the imperial authority. Right? Naturally, these men were often greedy, thus very expansive, as we will see in part, unruly, right? Because, again, you rely on people that inhabit in also different places, telling the truth, than your own. Maximilian, who knew his subjects, spotted in the mountains of Tyrol and in other provinces of his kingdom, telling the truth, some had nothing to do with mountains. There were, for example, a lot of Landsknechts from Westphalen, right? So from areas that we could start calling somehow industrial in an anachronistic sense, thus had more demographic and economical imbalances. There was more scum kind of being emarginated from the system. So rather than being exploited in that system, as we will see, this is a very important motivational factor. This man preferred to become imperial soldiers, which provided them with an important political, juridical status that other subjects did not have, right? So, the German youth was famous also for the solid, kind of rock-hard phase, at least that was, as we will see now, a very strict physical selection, also because there were lots of people who wanted to become soldiers. They never had problem, as we were saying before, to find the men. The problem was paying them, which was another thing. So they were even hyper selected because there was a great demand, and so you could discriminate more easily, right? Thus, in some cases, these recruits were not very different from the Swiss. Some of them arguably were also neighbors, right? They were eager to leave their valleys for a spirit of adventure. And moreover, they were habituated to the bloody feuds between one village and another. That was the normality in this kind of fringe world where, again, the authority was somehow, pretty relative. And thus people were literally habituated to some of the most brutally traumatic kind of violence. And just we perfectly know what pre-industrial systems were. Just they arrived late enough for us to document them effectively all over the world. I mean, systematic rape, abuse, incest, alcoholism, any kind of violence that is actually necessary to toughen up people that want to become professional manslaughterers, as these soldiers were technically to be, right? This was something that actually we have seen very often in the same nightly training in any form of properly what would have to become a de facto professional lifetime warrior, military man of sort, destroying the individual as such, basically killing him, and sometimes it literally happened because the abuse was of that scale, and then rebuilding it as a pure killing machine, because without that you cannot be at least an effective military man. So you can imagine already the paste that made up the substance, and needless to say, they were quite quick already with side weapons, and or also with other more kind of battle ones, if you want. The new thing was the pike. That again, only big states that could invest in that scale of training could provide, because literally, again, it costs a lot, right? For having 5,000 pikemen, you must have a very large country to draw that from in terms of men and resources. Again, most of these people were peasants. Doesn't matter whether mountaineers or whatever, they just were of that stock, of that background that would just make them see warfare as perhaps not even such a huge risk compared to what they already lead in this incredibly violent realities. Germany had lots of leagues. We didn't talk about them. They were always warring against each other. The Reformation, as you know, would bring to an unprecedented level of violence already for a land that didn't lack much of that. I made a video about German violence in the reign of Frederick II. It's not even that Germany was particularly more violent than other countries, bear it in mind. What I mean is that at a lower level, given that authority was somehow less present in such a decentralized, fragmented country, that the average person was more habituated to violence than others, right? At an individual personal level. Then, of course, like countries like France, like Spain, like Italy, and so on, but were pretty dramatically brutal in their own more kind of politically compacted systems, and even part of the Habsburgs' lands were, of course, more pacified to sustain also economically this effort. But again, this man came a bit from all of Germany, mostly the south, that would be tendential, in fact, more pro-Habsburg and later also more Catholic, as you know, was, telling the truth, even a bit the richer, but at least the mountains were the place where, again, thus had, being closer to richer places, where had men who were more habituated to say, I will go out of home, right? I will abandon the valley to go search for fortune somewhere. This had happened from both sides of the Alps, as we were saying before. Thus, in 1488, Maximilian's emissaries quickly recruited 12,000 volunteers. This was the first step, right? Such was the number of candidates that only the best could be selected. These men were trained to use the pike informations ordered by Swiss instructors that had been called from, actually illegally according to the confederal laws, because they were handsomely paid by the Habsburgs to betray the military secrets of their compatriots, and drilled, brutally within this order. And of course, they were also trained, or at least they were also let, developing their talents in the use of other weapons, such as we've seen, halberds, that were still a thing. Like, not even the Swiss had fully abandoned them for the troops either. They were just a minority. Other weapons that we will see now that were useful also in this first kind of properly 16th century warfare, mostly against the same pikes, and other weapons of sort, also guns, bows, etc., but mostly the pikes, thus forming the first army of Landsknechts. So the term Landsknecht is very eloquent because it literally means servant of the country, because Knecht does come from properly this ancestral proto-feudal ideal that you are a servant of a hero, nobleman, of a freeman, if you want. Lands, actually, the Saxon genitive, means of the land meant as of the country in general. Of course, Germany was, as still today by constitution, seen as multiple Länder, rather. But it was properly meaning that these were imperial soldiers. Knecht, as you understand it, has also the same etymological root of knight. And this, in a country like Germany, had a very specific meaning, if you want. I already made a video on the concept of Friede. That was an imperial prerogative, right? In German, etymologically, the term peace literally stems from the concept of the ancient Germanic peace in arms, right? Peace is an accomplishment because it means that you have a deterrent power, you can't knock the others out. It's just like the Roman civis pacem parabellum, right? And it was originally in the Holy Roman Empire an imperial prerogative to call a Landfried, that is to say, like a pacification of the country. That is the same way, telling the truth, through which the same Swiss Confederacy was born after imperial authority had collapsed in the 13th century, so that they would call it for themselves. Like, it's a way of making order, right? Let's say there is a feud, whatever, so let's put forces together, let's go kick ass those people who are making this mess, and let's assert our rule. And that's how the gentle ways in which the thing was done. And it was successful, in fact, at least to some extent, because again, Switzerland managed, don't think so easily even there, but to compact political, but other areas were, as we've seen, somehow out of control. And being considered a Knecht, and in this sense a Landsknecht, and thus an imperial servant, an imperial soldier, and this direct connection that you have with the sovereign, it conferred this man, as we'll see, with specific privileges, right? As many of these people had been somebody's people. Like in Germany, traditionally, people were somebody else's possession. If you were a peasant, you were under a lord, and you couldn't really do what you wanted, right? So becoming a Landsknecht instead meant that you were, in theory, still in kind of the ancestral Germanic idea, a true freeman. If you could bear arms, you would do it for yourself. So in this sense, the emperor was always acting, of course, as the monarch who favors the commoners to limit nobiliar power, and thus the Landsknecht felt himself elevated politically and socially, ennobled almost, in fact, by this knighting, we can even say, of course not meant in the truly nobiliar sense it had somehow become towards the end of the Middle Ages, but truly, again, in a much more modern and secular land than the average, still very much understood as truly, again, if I am a freeman in arms, I am technically a nobleman, like even a peer of the emperor, because that's the bond that we have, even though we are paid by him and we depend on him, but it's a mutual support, right? It's a bit like is slightly different, but the concept, for example, the janissaries, with which also the Landsknechts measured themselves in battle at some point, they were literally the Sultan's adoptive children, right? It was as slaves also this kind of almost like you are literally my possession, and that was slightly different from the Landsknechts and instead thought to be properly free, right? But they were freed by their role that the emperor had somehow created for them. So it was still, of course, a clientary connection that, however, made in this pretty socio-economically troubled Germany, as far especially as in fact the lower classes were concerned, an incredible redemptive and somehow exalting and in fact ennobling or transfiguring even experience, right? And it bore the seeds also of some ribellism and combatism, because creating a body of armed men that are true military professionals, by the way, in your country means that you are coming to challenge the establishment through them, at least in potential. This is the reason why a unitary country like France did not levy a national infantry for a long time, because they feared revolutions. And of course, such a big country, demographically, agriculturally, like France, had that problem. We have seen it because I made a video specifically about the early history of native French infantry during the Italian wars. Many people watched that because it's fascinating, because otherwise the French used the Swiss that came back in their mountains when the war was over. So in France, you didn't have dangerous veterans that could pick up arms against the noblemen. In Germany, instead, given that it was all fragmented, Maximilian understood that creating an opportunity of that kind could bring even to use these men as some sort of political leverage against the nobility that was traditionally limiting an imperial authority. Naturally, the thing would even go out of hand because, as you know, these men were truly seditious in some parts. Lutheranism also began to spread there, and as you know, the Habsburgs were the most absolute champions of Catholicism. So it wasn't easy to keep these men under, and at some point they also mutinied, rebelled, and with dramatic consequences, as we will see now with the sack of Rome. But Vienna herself, the capital de facto of the Habsburgs, while being freed by the Landsknechts from the Ottoman siege, still was threatened with extermination in the same way the Turks would have actually carried out. And in that case, if their pay had not been delivered, right? So they were dangerous, right? But they were still preferable in that kind of, again, heraldic mess that the empire was, as an instrument of political compaction of some sort as far as the benefit of the Habsburgs was concerned. There was a linguistic change over time, because from Landsknecht, the Landsknechts were called Landsknecht, so the Land's knight, right? Because they were mostly pikemen, so Lands as opposed to Lands was used. And in fact, they were mostly known by this name, Landsknechts, or I think in English is even it's the French version eventually mutated by English, like Landsknecht, like Lansquenets, right? And the plural in German is Landsknechte, right? At least at the nominative. Then it can be Landsknechten if you use the objective and so on. But this is not so relevant now. The point is framing them in their context. Thus, although they were born as pikemen, the weapon that characterized the Landsknechts was their inseparable short sword called Katzbalga, which already as a name is a program on its own, because it literally, Katzbalga literally means scuffle between cats, right? So it was a hand-to-hand dagger that, as you know, in Germany seemingly always had an important role. Think about the migration in Skramasax, again, in this very frontier area. The dagger had always remained very, very, very common, very frequent. There are interesting fancy manuals also about starting to appear at this late medieval time about these weapons. So the dagger was useful in battle as much as in a brawl in the tavern, right? And the Katzbalga flaunted at the Landsknechts side in a threatening horizontal position, right? That already literally pointed at the enemy, or the possible use and the danger of it. While less widespread than we usually think, just because it looks very iconic and kind of scenographic, was the gigantic Zweihänder, right? The two-handed broadsword up to 100 centimeters long and weighing even over 3 kilos, which in the flame-shaped blade version was called Flamberg, even though, again, it's mostly the blade, not the sword name. That was just the Zweihänder. And the Zweihänder were cumbersome and difficult to use because they, first of all, require a dramatic training. You need a great physique. So only the most powerful of the Doppelsoldners, that is to say the Landsknechts that were receiving double pay, were using them. And the role of these men was mostly conceived for opening gaps within the pikes during battle, so that eventually other troops could pour in the gaps. So it was almost a suicidal task, but it could cause considerable damage. Then over time, as we will see, this tactic would become somehow obsolete, especially because firearms were much more effective in somehow wearing down the pike squares. But at least at the beginning, and in context, we're still, not everything is a pitched battle with time or numbers or room for deploying a pike square. Like this Landsknecht could engage in sieges, in assaults, even in brawls, right, and chopping people to pieces with all this set of weapons that was, in fact, much less standardized than they think. And in the end, the Zweihänder became only parade weapons with a representative function, right? If you travel across Central Europe and you look at all these beautiful Schatzkammer and the armories and so on, you see some huge blades that you understand were impossible, impractical to use in combat, right? Everything that weighed more than 3.5 kilos practically cannot be used, right? It is true that there were people affected by giantism, and of course they may have created swords for them, but these are pretty standard. I mean, that's why the double-handed swords were used all over Europe in the same ways. It's not even, again, a national characteristic, like longbows are not just English and so on. So you just know that whenever somebody had to use it, had to be physically apt enough at least, and having all a series of other precautions probably that were needed, especially if they were exposed to the front line, to the pikes, extra armor that at this point is actually disappearing. Like most of the pikemen were unarmored, right? Especially the ones from the posterior ranks were more important for the formation, the mass, the nails, right? They were not exposed to particular fire. So a well-armored man equipped with a chopping weapon could, as it had always been actually for the knights that were actually the favored in using falchions rather than the peasant that allegedly would have developed this arm per se. But if you're not armored enough to get it that close to the enemy, you can't really use them. And so again, you can see it even in the illustrations that I uploaded here. Literally, pieces of human beings scattered all over the field, because this was really the normality, aside from some cannonball, as it happened against the Swiss at Marignano, that could literally center like a bullying strike, making limbs flying off from all sides, and the guts, blood, and everything. Literally, people, even in the Renaissance, were pretty much, as involved still in hand-to-hand fighting at close range and chopping each other to pieces, and it would remain a long tradition, let's say, in warfare still. Another weapon actually used by Landsknechts was the halberd, as we were saying, used to exploit the gaps that opened between the tight ranks of pikemen. And with time, the first firearms assumed increasing importance. The arquebus or arquebuses that existed from a long time, but let's say they became tactically relevant or as an arm on its own, as a shot in the end of the 14th century. Then still at this time, as we've seen, the Swiss had won fundamentally without much of firepower. Most of it was gathered only in forms of cannons after they looted the Burgundian ones after their victories. But as you know, during the 16th century, the arquebus starts becoming properly another, say, in combined arms, a fixed component of these armies, and being always undecisive, because, as you know, this was light infantry fundamentally. Just like light infantry by definition doesn't beat the heavy one alone, so it was just a way of wearing out, together with artillery and especially still cavalry shocks, that even during the 16th century, even in the moment of greatest contraction of cavalry in the mid of the century, were still there and did always the same thing that cavalry does. That is only one possible, because cavalry otherwise cannot do literally anything else, charging, right? Cavalry cannot defend. If it does, it's because the men dismounted and became infantry. So warfare was pretty dynamic. In many ways, you could never tell what could produce itself on a battlefield. And just think about the mess, even just gunpowder. At every volley, you had this thick mist on the field, you couldn't see anything. So everything was much more messy than we normally think. At the Battle of Bicocca during the Italian Wars, fought on April the 27th, 1522, the imperial general, the Tyrolese Georg von Frundsberg, that had contributed dramatically, together with other German noblemen, to the development of the Landsknechts, personally ascertained the effectiveness of the Spanish arquebusiers in stopping specifically the onslaught of the hated Swiss that had become, as we've seen, they were the enemies of the Habsburgs, and plus now the Germans had copied their tactics, so they hated each other dramatically. Immediately increased as well the number of arquebuses among the Landsknechts to imitate what were the most updated, in fact, Spanish accomplishments. These aspects are very interesting. The Swiss initially had very strict regulations for preventing anyone from their country going abroad selling their service, not just in the form of an instructor, but literally as a soldier. Then eventually, lots of Swiss began to be mercenaries abroad. I mean, there were also many Swiss Landsknechts at some point, deserters, people again that had preferred to serve the Habsburgs or other powers independently from the cantons. But for a long time, there was this feud between the Swiss and the Landsknechts, because the latter were felt to be, again, the arch enemy, right? And the ones that had copied first the Swiss model, and that had somehow also been opposed to the Confederacy for political reasons. By the time of Bicocca, we are in Charles V's reign, and thus we already have the union between Germany and Spain, and Landsknechts had the important model that we were referring to before with Gonzalo de Cordova, the Grand Capitan, that is the one that literally created modern warfare. Is also easily the greatest commander in modern history, that had brought on the fore, as we've seen, this combined arms tactics that would be, in fact, the ones that the Tercio standardized all over Europe, right, by imitation, right, more than the Swiss that had basically brought on the fore just the infantry squares, and that the more conservative Germans had somehow had more trouble to integrate, but by imitation, thanks to the professionalism of the Landsknechts, succeeded in doing so. This would give them an edge, also, in fact, on the hated Swiss that were more conservative in that regard. Consider that the commanders involved here were pretty tough individuals and men of war, right? The Georg von Frundsberg, for example, at the Battle of Pavia, literally fought in the front line with the pikemen, right? And by Spanish influence, the Landsknechts acquired further this idea that the noblemen had to serve on foot. Even part of the Landsknecht clothes fashion is actually Spanish in origin, and the tradition of imperial officers to serve first in the ranks of the pikemen, while rising in the ranks, was alive still by the 30 Years' War, right? It was something you find at the time of Montecuccoli still, and it specifically derived from the fact that the Spanish Tercio was composed by a large amount of noblemen, or at least of gentry, because at the end of the Reconquista, like 1/3 of the Spanish adult males was technically an hidalgo, right? And thus there was the idea that there was a noble enterprise. And as we've seen, the Landsknechts were somehow associating it from their German background to the idea again that whoever was in arms was a freeman, and that every freeman, according to the old rules, was a nobleman, right? Whoever can bear arm can bear the imperium in a way. So there was a very interesting combination of factors that was between identity, need of redemption, and military professionalism, and this international contests to be bloodily settled on the battlefield that would favor the development of the Landsknechts. First of all, importance literally from a political point of view for the Habsburgs, but secondly also for themselves, right? As a true, as a sort of court that we cannot call like this exactly, because they weren't really a permanent force per se, but in a way this profession was somehow treasured, and there was a very strong sense of belonging, right? Also, those could be called back to serve again, and thus making the Landsknecht identity surviving the generations. The Swiss had taken the violation of their monopoly very badly, right? And despite being already famous for their ferocity, on the occasions when they clashed with the Landsknecht imitators, let's say, they managed to outdo themselves, demonstrating an even more ruthless fury and rivalry that inflamed the battlefields all over Europe. At the Battle of Bicocca, it was precisely their blind ardor in wanting to come to blows with the Landsknechts that was the main cause of their defeat. Right? And that tells you how deeply they hated each other. And again, certain levels of violence that are difficult to find even by Renaissance standards, where, as you know, things were all pretty brutal everywhere. because you do need hatred to fight. It's the third element of the Clausewitzian Trinity, the one corresponding to the people properly. And these were basically fourth estaters, again, that had their kind of primitive enmity just in their genetics, in their blood, and being successfully used as such. And consider that in a strictly military, historical, kind of elemental sense, the Habsburgs had been using the Swiss model from a quite early time. It's, for example, at the Battle of Ginegat, that the Flemish, rather than the German troops that had been trained by Swiss instructors, as ordered by Maximilian, managed to score, let's call it a victory over the French, right after basically 2 centuries of total Flemish defeats against any French, whether they were French or Burgundians, right? And never be blinded by Courtrai and a bit like Montpavel. After that, until Ginegat, the Flemish were exclusively defeated, and exactly by the same feudal French culture that they had allegedly, put to sleep at Courtrai, which evidently is not the case of. But say Maximilian at that point was still believing he could essentially affirm that kind of political and social model that came from the military demands that using such a Swiss-style military force could be installed in Flanders, right? Instead, the Flemish at that point were like, no, like it costs too much, we don't want it. And there it wouldn't graft, right? It's not before the armies of Maurice of Nassau that in the lowlands you really have an updated army, because those were not. But it should be pointed out that the Landsknechts still fought in the Netherlands against the Frisians, scoring significant victories against them. The Frisians had been, even up to the 15th century, a very unruly people that had also caused massacres of German noblemen that had tried to subdue them, because they managed to skillfully exploit these narrow paths among the marshes of their kind of swampy areas, and they were pretty, stardy, brutal individuals that really, would chop these knights to pieces. Well, in that, the Landsknechts kind of distinguished themselves, right, repressing brutally the Frisians, and thus also showing how just what was this rebel, spirit that could even bring to these communities that literally had nothing but their own violence to challenge the establishment, could not match the most updated art of war that now was properly fielded by entire states, and that would crush these rebels under their heels. This is interesting because also the early Swiss were like that, but then they evolved in the mid-15th century in that, as we've seen, this kind of professional mode that trained the pikemen to be, intensely trained for a long time for important, also service abroad, right, in at least the campaigns outside their own cantons. Thus, you have properly a qualitative step forward in the art of war in this context. And Maximilian was so proud of the Landsknechts and so also careful to maintain their loyalty that he famously equipped himself on multiple occasions as a pikeman himself, together with his men, right? He equipped himself with this Swiss-style military force. He was careful to select practically exclusively his own faithful subjects, thus trying to distance as much as possible the possibility of, dangerous political ideologies spreading within his army. Recruiting in the local area, of course, fostered harmony among men. the companies, even the regiments, were preferably coming from the same communities, relatives, friends joined. This had been a bit also part of the reason why the Swiss had been so successful, because this, in that case, they literally belonged to cantonal communities that lived literally in the same valley. I mean, that was their world, their universe, and they just contributed freely, in theory, to the broader Swiss effort that was, however, still a bit like the Germanic confederacies of the migration era. Like, we know them for their international shout-out, but individually they didn't even identify with that name. They identified with local tribe, right? And there is much of that sense of folk in the Swiss army that contributed to the development of a solid esprit de corps, and this is exactly what Maximilian was very careful in developing as much as possible, especially, again, under this reign at the beginning of the Landsknechts era. Even the structure and organization of the Landsknechts regiments, however, strengthened their internal cohesion, as well as their military effectiveness and combativeness. This is important, serving together with other people that maybe you do not know, but that at some point you share with so much that as a broader experience you feel as brothers in arms, which is typical of combatism, of also veteran memory and syndromes as well, because once you joined the Landsknechts, it was very difficult to come back to previous life, right? And as we've seen, these men were aware of their military potential, even as civilians. Telling the truth, there was no difference at the time between a military man and a civilian. At least they were not so to distinguished environments like today. So they began to nurture this rebellistic ideas in saying, I'm a Landsknecht, I'm not like one of these other stinky, cowardly peasants that prefer just to live together with their animals for the rest of their lives, paying their cannons to the local noblemen, right? The local nobleman cannot touch me because I'm an emperor's soldier. And this, especially in a country where the Protestant Reformation was about to erupt, as you understand, was at the base of a great deal of troubles, right? Even the peasant war. And it doesn't matter that, of course, here we talk about Landsknechts just in an imperial sense, but even the fighting styles were becoming somehow homogeneous. Like, even if a rebel force of peasants could equip themselves with pikes, like, it was more complicated. But if some of them had been Landsknechts, because these were all commoners, you understand that it was easier to spread the knowledge among the masses of this military capacities, something that had up to that point in Germany specifically had been just a monopoly of the nobility. So again, never underestimate these ideas. Never underestimate, say, what the Hussites had showed could be possible. Not the wagon fort tactics that actually are one of the single most overrated thing ever, but properly the concept. This is the single most powerful thing. The idea that a literal no one, the scum of the earth, without any names, without any title, without any earth, can pick up a weapon and start killing noblemen, right? This is something like, it's as if now a communist terrorist wanted to take over, right? And you understand why also they, during the Reformation, said people hated each other so much, and how many feelings were fueling the conflicts of the time, right? And just think about the sack of Rome, the hatred towards the Catholics, because as we will see, in spite of the fact that these were imperial soldiers, Lutheranism spread among them as well, and as you know, went out of control, because Charles V would have never tolerated a sack of Rome, which is basically stained his reputation was a tragedy in the Habsburg court, internationally, and even more in a broader universal sense. So when enlisting, the Landsknechts technically swore allegiance to the emperor, and at the same time were thus bound by the regulations governing military life, as if this had been properly a community, like the other ones from which these men came from, that also regulated themselves similarly, because from whichever village you were, there was some sort of mob that dictated what the rules were and how you had to behave, what the punishments really were. Of course, there was a super mob, like in the form of the noblemen, and so the feudal hierarchy. But as we've seen, this self-regulatory attitude that we've seen with the Landfried in the areas that were kind of more decentralized was something they were somehow habituated with. These regulations specified in details the tasks, duties, responsibilities, and emoluments of each of the components of the imperial regiment, and being valid for the entire military community, were not only egalitarian conceptually, but also subjected its members to a special and literal Landsknecht jurisdiction, which, this is the actual point, surpassed the civilian one. Right, were things that as a Landsknecht you could not be subjected to. Right, where you were in many aspects above the civilian law. As you understand, for men again that psychologically from half of a millennium or more, they had just been habituated to be another person's possession, the egalitarian principle of the Landsknechtry, let's say, meant for them, and why they would be so proud and ready to die for it. This aspect cannot be stressed enough. The Oberst, the colonel, and the commander at the top of the regimental hierarchy earned 400 florins a month and received another 150 for his entourage, because these were still somehow noblemen that could join, by the way, because many of them were, right, and were also fighting, as we've seen with the Frundsberg, literally in the front line together with the other pikemen, and under enemy cavalry charges and volleys, and that means having some guts, let me tell you, to say the least. That this is not something that people missed just in those times. There are some military operations also in Bohemia against the Turks, where you realize that just what the average person was made of, and at least the ones who joined this profession particularly. A simple Landsknecht, private local in this way, was paid 4 florins a month. Now consider that a laborer earned just 1.6. Thus 4 florins a month was a decidedly attractive sum, not counting any proceeds from war spoils and the possibility, albeit limited, as you understand from a statistical point of view, of moving up the hierarchical and thus salary ladder. Right, so again, you were worth almost double the average person. This aspect, again, is in a world where there is no such abstract concept like today of enforced equality, is to be clearly stressed. In the past, people were measured by their individual worth. It was also a quite concrete one, right? At the time, it was still, say, in Europe, there wasn't really slavery in the way we intend, except for maybe the Ottoman slaves and so on during periods in the Mediterranean. But the social divides were radical, And especially in this moment that we think, the age of humanism, of the rise of the commoners. Absolutely not. This is a myth that I don't know. I mean, I know actually the reasons why it's spread, but that actually adults still believe in, and they completely have a diametrically opposite understanding of what the modern age was. This was the pure ancien regime. The end of the Middle Ages didn't free people at all. They locked them in a crystallized hierarchy that was by far much more stratified and unchangeable than the one that had existed in medieval times. Right? So, especially, again, in countries like Germany that were quite feudal, privatized, etc., the concept is if you're a peasant, you're just a dirty animal. And nothing, you're not a human being. You're just a lesser race. So again, think what it meant for this man to be armed, to be given a chance, to be even paid double time what one of those dirty animals were, and feeling protected and having a direct channel of communication, at least through their hierarchy, to the emperor himself. This is a huge honor, a huge prerogative, something you would literally live and die for. Becoming a Landsknecht represented a remarkable form of social promotion for these individuals who came mostly from the peasant class, and not only in an economic sense, in a cultural sense too. Always remember this. This is the key point. If you want to mark one thing about Landsknechts, you have to remember for all your life is this redemptional value of the service, given what Germany was at the time. If you want to read or know what Germany was at the time, I'd say this is actually from the 30 Years' War, but it's not that much had changed at all. Read Simplicissimus by von Grimmelhausen. That really opens your eyes on what Germany was, right? The rural reality, the peasant reality, and when you read that and you understand that, you understand what this promotion meant. Because how people lived in those conditions, it's something that is beyond your nightmares, right? And this was the only way, in many ways, you could escape from it. Without mentioning that, as it always happened among the newly redeemed and the most, in this sense, ideologically zealous, the Landsknechts were radically brutal and devoid of any form of human mercy against the same anyone they encountered, peasants included. I mean, they hated them for reminding them that they were actually of the same pace. At least they were so proud of having been elevated from that whichever enemy they found in that regard was not even thought that they were just mostly poor peasants that, again, were absolute from a moral point of view that they had nothing to, no merit to claim by any stretch of the imagination, as of course the people have been the single most disgustingly ignorant, stupid, evil, aggressive, and violent element of society. But that's exactly the point, right? That you cannot have an army if you do not have the injection of these elements within it. And if you study how the peasant war was repressed in Germany, or how most of the wars among the various leagues were conducted, the confessional wars, well, I'd suggest you to give a look to it, right? Speaking of baths of blood is reductive. And these were the men who carried that out. Like plain butchery, like much bloodier than a slaughterhouse, to say the least. And consider even the religious aspect of it all, like what they were fighting for in an ultimate kind of level of, realization of mankind, right? Can mankind owe its salvation to their work, or anybody who thinks this is already sinning completely? How far does your faith go, right? And so that is also an enormous fuel from both sides for radical unrestrained violence without, and I must stress this again, without any traceable form of human mercy. Even if enlistment subordinated the Landsknechts to an extremely rigid discipline, by the way, because in order to keep these men under, you had literally to break their teeth every time they thought they had anything like a personal opinion, because that's also how you cannot have a soldier otherwise. It was, however, true that the enlistment freed the Landsknecht from the condition of a civilian whose obligations and constraints in the society of the time were no less asphyxiating, right? So in many ways, again, between being abused by your superior officers, by the the necessities of war, of having to storm an enemy position, getting again in that meat grinder, being maybe a doppelsoldier that had to break the enemy lines by literally suiciding himself, butchering people along the way for the others to follow, well, may have been actually better than remaining under the constant vexation of the nobility in your homeland. Constant abuse, rape, violence, exactions, right? Again, the German nobility, as all the Central European one, was characterized by the single most atrocious form. Well, okay, the Eastern one was worse than that, but there we're talking about Mongols, literally, because the political culture was exclusively that. But you pick the Polish Szlachta, you pick the German nobility and beyond. Literally, peasants are animals, and you treat them exclusively as animals. Noblemen are something else. They're literally another race, and they have all the right to rule in virtue of their blood and their moral superiority over these dirty animals that are literally treated as such. This is the background from which they came. So you can imagine there also what was the sense of social conflict that, in fact, is very famously expressed during the Reformation, right? Lots of people that are namely fighting under the banners of this or that confession or whatever are actually the same usual martyrs from any age that joined just to raid, pillage, exterminate, enslave, and so that's where they may do it again for this sense of revenge, of oppression, of sense that of rejection, literally, of the traditional hierarchy. So don't think again that what we see many times in history, even included today, doesn't have to do with that. It was done in different ways by different in different degrees and with different backgrounds and so on. But there was much of that. So just imagine in these conflicts, not at all like romantic conservatives. I'm right-wing myself, as you know, but I don't buy the historical delusions that most people, right or left-wing, really embrace for either nationalistic or socialistic or actually both reasons, that think, these were such great times where men were men and, everything was so great because it was traditional society. It was actually, again, a nightmare. So the reason why people were strong is that the system was just, I'm not talking even just politically, of course it was the most important thing, but it was just terrifying to live in. I mean, it was oppressive just by think about surviving nature in the 16th century, or illnesses, or again these raids, distractions, etc. It's really dramatic, to say the least. Thus, the Landsknecht saw himself, and interestingly enough, was seen by society at the time as a proudly free man. He demonstrated this by adopting his own fashion in clothing, right? All that kind of flamboyant, strange, and actually extreme expression of individualistic exhibitionism did derive also from this sense of kind of being free from any social restriction, right? Socially accepted canons were thrown out of the window. And thus the Landsknecht was not just a freeman like others that existed, but as such, as part of that imperial soldier, distinguished himself from any other social class. Remember, these people were destroyed as human beings and rebuilt as slaughtering machines. So you cannot be a civilian. You can't be a peasant anymore. You don't come back, because after you go through what you go through to become a Landsknecht, there's no coming back. You're not a nobleman. You're not a priest. You're not this. You're a Landsknecht. And that's how highly they thought of themselves. And this, of course, is still part of traditional order, because the Holy Roman Empire had in its estates lots of different, representations. For example, the knights themselves in Germany, because still this kind of ancestral idea that whoever bore arms somehow was endowed with the imperium, for which the Germans also struggled with the papacy in the investiture controversy, etc., was there. There was an estate of knights that was represented in imperial diet. Germany was a bit the hypertrophic symbol of that kind of federal system that, again, still today is at the base of the German constitution. They're not one country, there are different countries together as one. Thus, every peculiarity was represented, and the Landsknecht one came to be a quite distinguished one. It was specified in the official documents as such, and also reaffirmed in the anthology of songs and poetic compositions that were born sometimes in the same Landsknecht camps during moments of rest, and constituted a new and original artistic genre, for example, that wanted to renew the glories of chivalric composition. There is a bit of Minnesänger there, surely, and the idea again of the beauty and the terror of war, and the sense of impending doom, a bit stemming from the Norse kind of Age of the Wolf, storming of the Asgard, right? And excited, probably in the folk tales of 16th century Germany, orally transmitted. God knows how they were, but been beautiful and still very attached to that kind of background. And of course, again, the peak of male violence is just biologically associated with the peak of artistic expression. So the Minnesänger were mostly knights, as you know. Back in the day, there were very strong traditions, especially in lands like southern Germany, where these men came from. So there was a bit of a imitation, even though in this kind of more commoner sauce, which was also much more, let's say, vulgar, as you can imagine, in many ways, not necessarily in the sense that they were talking about lower things, but that reflected the background of the Landsknecht that we've seen before. And it's interesting that these songs, this music circulated, because it means that the rest of the community was, of course, aware of the role of the Landsknechts. There were many men who joined the army in this sense, and so there was a fascination with that toying of the idea of the freedom and the use of arms that among the descendants of the ancient German tribesmen this was still kind of felt perhaps more ignitingly ready than in other countries, perhaps the more modern secularized one. Maximilian the First of Habsburg, as you understand, the key figure here, himself worked to ennoble the Landsknechts by entering the cities he visited on foot and with a pike on his shoulder, accompanied by a procession of nobles who were also on foot and armed with a pike. So, also, let's say, humiliating the nobility in front of the imperial prestige that would show how more, say, closer to that kind of direct exercise of arms and kind of even blind luck that the average trooper underwent in his campaign could boost the sense of core in the entire Habsburgic realm in a political and social sense. Naturally, these were incredibly privileged people that just showed off like that, and so, but they were also men of war. I mean, they risked their lives. Maximilian was a great commander of the time, so was, as we've seen, these German noblemen who literally were the makers of the Landsknecht corps. We can't call it like this because they organized the whole thing. They were the ones who had the experience, even the managerial capacity, because they owned men and lands, and so they knew how to organize an army to bring the supplies in. They were the true entrepreneurs, like in a feudal culture, the true establishment at the end of the day. So of course, also showing themselves more similar to the men made the latter kind of, more excited about having such leaders, right? That said that these guys think our own way. And again, it's always the same model historically. It's not the simplified version, the tyrant versus the people, that also somehow began to spread as a general anti-universal, anti-traditional ideology, especially in Protestantism, that still lives to this very day, the blaming the single guy, right? Actually, the system is very different. The monarch usually is more sympathetic to the people, and the nobility counters this, but the nobility is actually the one that has more value morally, and that's why it's still part of the establishment, than the people that actually are the worst element of the community. So the universal hierarchy stressed this, and in a way it's these fourth estaters that came to challenge also through this radical religious ideologies the necessity of the authority of the order, etc. Right? And not that the establishment didn't have his share of fault, because the idea that if tradition collapses, yes, it's the people's fault, but it's at the same time fault of the establishment that was not enough to maintain the order. So this is what we call modern Europe is in a broader narrative. Needless to say that by behaving like showing off like a pikeman, Maximilian gave enormous prestige to his infantry, and he implicitly invited the wealthier classes to serve as officers in the imperial army, rather than in the more traditional local feudal cavalry that just fights for his own local honor, prestige of the house, and private possessions, right? So the strong sense of identity developed by the Landsknechts also in the other estates, and the collective awareness of being free laborers had consequences, not just in the internal life of the units, but also in the relationships with their superiors and clients. Because many noblemen, as you understand, began to use these men on their own, right? What you see here is also a very interesting mechanism that we can speak both from a political, social point of view, also from a strictly military, even technological point of view. Why Germany, right? And why also did the Landsknechts didn't have a future later, and they died fundamentally as a force in the early modern age. Still, they didn't make it to be a kind of a German national army, as it could be the one of another country, as Landsknechts, because of course the imperial soldiers remained, but that kind of previous identity wouldn't last. Well, we'll see it in a while. You can argue, however, that Germany is one of those countries that during the Middle Ages had in relative terms, the greatest development, meaning that even if Southern Europe was more advanced throughout the millennium, countries like, say, England, Germany, in relative terms, grew more, right? So much that by the end of the Middle Ages, for example, in this very time, Germany was the most technologically advanced country in Europe, together with Italy. And this is very interesting because, by the way, now we're just talking about the Landsknechts, but German warfare has quite interesting features during this time. Think about the wheel-lock pistols. The German clockmakers had there some interesting role, right, in contributing to the introduction of that technology. Think about the Reiter, the caracol, which is actually a term coming from Spanish, but that was mostly associated with the German tactics, right? So we're looking at actually another one of the last great expansional phases of the Middle Ages. The Peasants' War in Germany in the 16th century, still more like a medieval phenomenon than a modern one. After the 16th century, the system contracts a bit once again. You see it even in the Habsburg house that gets divided again, and it's just only by the end of the 17th that the German area begins to politically and socially compact, and it's not until the 19th century that Germany comes to be truly a power among powers, right? Because the cultural and social background was still very primitive, right? So what you see actually in these contexts, even the Landsknechts as a military reality is more like a consequence of this Malthusian cycles, right? Of again the almost like the same ones that triggered maybe in part the Viking era, right? It was a political thing, but it's the idea that maybe there is the end of a great expansion cycle where there is a demographic increase and these people actually do not know where to get their food from and they go abroad as mercenaries. This had happened at the beginning of the 14th century. Waves of Germans that go fighting abroad. This kind of Landsknechtry here is also part of that, of this great, let's say, social, religious movement that also triggers, in fact, the Peasants' War, the Reformation, and that sees almost, in fact, what in France had been like the Jacquerie, right? So a true revolutionary, brutal, violent, extremistic attempt to overthrow the established order that instead is brutally repressed and so crystallizes the thing further, right? So the Landsknechts actually are shrouded in this kind of dark legend, also of stereotypical German brutality, but considered that, especially after the 30 Years' War, and considering the fact that Germany had been ravaged by various armies, by foreigners, etc., marched in, raided far and wide, the Germans were actually believed stereotypically to be actually a mild, kind of weak people. Right, in the 18th century, notoriously, also the thing continued in the sense that Germany and Italy were considered the so-called weak areas of Europe because they hadn't compacted a political force. They had somehow become the battlefields of where the other European powers fought. Right, so these dynamics, seen from, especially from the perspective of the people, this largely agricultural realities and so on, highlight even more the burdens, the force, the cracking point of these communities, the abuse that they can suffer, in the sense of revenge, of again redemption, of promotion that can derive from literally picking up arms and going out there and having their voice felt. The greater problem, however, seems to have been political and institutional. That is to say, the Holy Roman Empire couldn't provide at that time with a true solid center, right? Austria, the Habsburgs, as you know, just like the Hohenzollern later failed to centralize in Germany, they mostly have to expand abroad, right? Most of the lands and people they ruled over were outside Germany, in Hungary, in Prussia. So it doesn't matter how, there were islands of Germans, there were the majority were not. And the reason is, again, that failure that we have documented for the medieval history series of the failure of the creation of a national monarchy, differently from England, from France, and thus the impossibility of a kind of greater centralization, and thus the possibility of having larger bodies of drilled, well-equipped, disciplined troops that at this point were fielded mostly by, in fact, the most politically compact and richer countries, France, Spain, right? Also, in this sense, in the 16th century, Habsburgic power was very strong, right? Before the different arrangements, the split of the Austrian and Spanish branches, and so on, but also the general crisis that kicked in again in the 17th century. So the Landsknechts are a bit the pinnacle of this kind of German awakening, of this last expansion of the cycle before the further contraction. And it's really important to see them also in their political instances, in their combatism, in their veteran identity, as such, right? And this is perhaps the best way to define the Landsknechts, that is to say, a free and democratic body, right? They were emphasizing freedom, but also as a democratic force. That is to say, we are equal in arms. We do come from the demos, telling the truth, because they were all commoners, and at least there was an internal hierarchy. There was still some feudal one, as we've seen. There were noblemen as officers, but there was also a sense of themselves as a freely acting and freely fighting corps of some sort. The recruitment contract subjected the Landsknecht to a long series of duties, but also specified his rights, right, and established that each unit had, for example, a spokesperson who was elected monthly by all the Landsknechts gathered in assembly to maintain simpler and more immediate relations with the military hierarchies. In other words, the troops had always a voice in the way the army was regulated, organized. What was really the reward delivered like? Because pays were not so regular. As we've seen, it was not yet a true state that was sustaining them. So this man felt directly called and engaged in the same political causes of their employers. Some of them, as we were saying before, were also just at the disposal as veterans of the local noblemen. Say you were a Landsknecht serving the empire abroad for some years. Then you came back to Germany and you started living as a freeman still, that you had, a title that you had earned anyway because of your service in the local community. And of course, the local lords would consider you because you surely knew how to fight, how to keep an order. You were, say, maybe not revered, because the Landsknechts definitely did have a dark fame by some regard, but surely you were feared, let's put it in this way. So you could be a good element in the Lord's retinue, right? So you could train the other clients militarily. So again, the boundary between the public and the private, especially in a country like Germany, was very blurred, right? So this paradoxically stressed even more the sense of freedom, because it was an earned freedom. It was not a certified freedom. It was just inherent in the type of of job that you had as such. So in fact, you could defend yourself banally. You could kill. You were dangerous. You were experienced. So all precious qualities. And in this sense, too often for the Landsknechts, it was the commitments made by the military leaders that were disregarded. As we have said, perpetually late payments, rewards not granted, food that was too scarce or of poor quality were the most frequent complaints, and this provoked an open reaction from the men in the ranks, which those same leaders tried to condemn as sedition. So an act of insubordination and or worse, mutiny, even rebellion, maybe even taking up arms, siding with the Lutherans against the emperor. It did happen, right? Or threatening again to massacre everyone if had not been paid. I made a video about the 1535 conquest of Tunis by Charles V. And there are very interesting stories about the military service of the Landsknechts. Some of them we know their life, right? I made a video about I think it was about Erasmus of Rotterdam, that was describing a bit all these in this kind of Renaissance dialogue style, the takes on war and peace, of life and death. Those are typical universalistic topics of humanism of authors like him. And there is the stereotype of the soldier, of this guy going young and full of promises to war, and then to life and promises, and then coming back home old, actually worse from a moral point of view, at least having ruined himself, not really having earned as much as he had hoped for, and thus having wasted his life, and even being poorer than before, maybe lame, crippled, whatever, and thus showing the still in a Christian sense, of course, the vacuity of earthly things, in a lifestyle that was also quite material, as we will see now: money, alcohol, women, and so on. So it was still somehow stigmatized by the standards of the time, because it was there were much greater extremes in many ways, and still the soldiery didn't have much of a moral reputation, of course. But it's a bit like, I don't know, the Barry Lyndon kind of story, right? You're always seeking for fortune with extreme risks, and you end badly anyhow, even if you are a courageous soldier, and so on. And we've seen that story, which this guy participating in the Tunisian expedition, he had, I think he was Swiss specifically. Eventually he came back home, and he tried to start a business, but that went badly, and he hadn't earned anything in that enterprise, even though it was a great victory of Christianity. Then eventually Tunisia was recaptured by the Ottoman proxies, but those are kind of the questions that the world at the time also posed himself, in this, again, lack of a center of these endless series of calamities that were, again, tremendously perceived. Not just all the war being fought in Europe, but again, the fracture of Christendom, the worst possible thing that could happen from a medieval European perspective, in absolute terms, because it was a metaphysical destruction. Satan literally ruling on earth, and the Ottomans, in this sense, being the proof of it as God's punishment for Christian sins. And it was self-evident, because literally, if Christians had been united, the Ottoman Empire would have been wiped out, but this was never achieved, and Protestants were arguably happier if the Ottomans massacred some Catholic than anything, right? They if the Catholics had won. So we were at those extremes that, as we will see now, brought even to other catastrophic results. The hunger for unreliability and greed of the Landsknechts was therefore largely an expression of conflicts over the interpretation of the rules and on the interpretation of politics, of the world, or how people had to live, what they had to believe, and whose allegiance they had to owe. The Landsknechts as a group demanded respect with meticulousness, right, and with particular attention to their own interests. So in a sense, they were provided with an important degree of autonomy, as it was proven again also by their blackmail and unloyalty to a cause that was not their personal one. The pinnacle of the military history of the Landsknechts was reached in the Battle of Pavia on February 24th, 1525. They captured Francis I of France, right? At times in which sovereigns still risked their own lives. It was a slaughter of French nobility, as you know. The serfs of the French knights didn't even have the money to ransom the corpses of their own lords. It was a terrible thing. Actually, the capture of Francis I was source of great embarrassment for the Saint Charles V, that of course was happy of having won the war, but not of having now the burden to maintain in prison the French king, who also risked to die of illness during the same time, but he was very well treated, of course, and the same Charles frequented him because they were kind of still as enemies acting as brothers, but at some point even slept in the same bed. When Francis was ill and they thought he was about to die, Charles stayed there, it's like, oh, let's hope he doesn't die, and apparently just Francis, maybe because he was habituated to French cuisine, was not so happy of beans that he was served in Spain or in the place of his prison. But aside from this, Francis was also pretty shrewd and kind of very modern, kind of Renaissance Machiavellian ruler, whereas Charles V was rather still a Burgundian knight, right? Of all the identities of his vast possessions, Charles V was literally like a Flemish, like a Burgundian knight who was brought up in Bruges, right? He wasn't even particularly connected with Austria for that, but of course he cared enormously, but by background, and he was a much more chivalric person, at least ideally, right? He also did his share of nasty things, but they were also compatible individuals. But Francis promised to give part of the French Burgundian heritage to Charles, imprison it, and when he came back to France, he sent famously his children in exchange for him as prisoners, but he wouldn't give back anything because he said, I was enforced to promise so in prison, so everything was that kind of politically necessary, by the way, because the Saint Francis I was trying to save, the French monarchy and the unity of the state, and successfully so, by the way. So that it's not that he even liked the Turks particularly, but he was surrounded as much as anybody was at the time. But again, his capture was the merit of the Landsknechts that actually were butchering French noblemen, in part also because of that bias that we have seen, but it was like during the slaughter that, again, the enormous courage of just the king of being understanding it was over, but still fighting to the death, literally, was recognized by one of the Landsknechts. He says, this is the king, in German, and so they spared him, but he was hard to tame because he was defending himself atrociously. In any case, he finally gave up. And in the Battle of Pavia, as you know, fought the park of the villa of Mirabella. Von Frundsberg's troops lined up with the Empire, of course. And then there were the traitors of the so-called Black Guard, right, or the Black Band, that were Landsknechts in the service of the French, under Francis I. So this shows essentially the same that had happened with the Swiss, that of course part would betray and pass to the other side. And the Black Band was also the best infantry in Francis I's service, surpassing even the Swiss. Quite a prize there. Von Frundsberg, after putting to flight what remained of the Swiss already beaten at Bicocca, so putting to sleep, let's say, the myth also of the Swiss infantry that at Marignano also suffered, as you know, the knockout, really, as they were butchered down because they remained blocked in front of artillery fire, basically. Found himself facing the same Black Band that was alone left to hold the field. This is yet another feature of these mercenaries that you say, but mercenaries, we have been told from Machiavelli to the Romanticism that they are bad and they don't fight for the truth. Well, these men were so proud at the time they would even fight to the death for causes that were not their own. Naturally, in many cases, there is no way to abandon the field without being massacred too, so fighting to the death is maybe the only sensible choice at some point. But there was a lot of spirit, a lot of pride. It's a bit like Cambronne's words of Waterloo. So after a very violent fight, animated by the mutual hatred, and the Black Band of Francis I, surrounded and overwhelmed by numbers, was destroyed down to the last man. Right? In every battle there is a unit that basically fights to the death, sometimes allowing also the rest of the army to escape more successfully. But, you know, being killed to the death, as you know, in military history is like the most fulgent example of absolute honor, of responsibility towards the unit, the man giving the example, and these men were competing with each other. They didn't want to be less than any others. We've seen this sense of egalitarianism was deeply ingrained in their identity. They didn't know any other world. They had already seen death many times, if anything, because they had also dispensed it quite generously. Let's put it in this way. And so for them, after all, as it happens to many soldiers, you arrive to a point where, you know, whether you live or die, maybe it's not really even the most important thing, or at least that's a hell of a way to die, because these are the great battles of the Renaissance, whereas most of these people would die just of, you know, of illness and or some shitty ditch somewhere that nobody would ever remember. So making the last stand at the Battle of Pavia is, you know, just something that surely will make the Black Band remembered. More in general, in the sense, unfortunately for the Landsknechts, their autonomous nature contrasted with the Needs and the properly multinational nature of the empire. Here we're talking about German, as if there was a truly unitary sense in that regard. It is true that since the Middle Ages there was a national, or proto-national if you prefer, sense of Germanity, of Frenchness, of Italianness, of whatever. But the local identities prevailed. right? By far, very often, say the Germans especially hated each other between Northerners and Southerners in ways that are to be found. I studied these things personally. Medieval history, medieval warfare, you really do find quarrels among them, splitting one side for the emperor, one even for the papal cause, or at least the enemies of the emperor, because they did so on the lines of a regional basis, right? And this what was controlled by the German Empire was pretty large, also territorially, geographically. Germany had been, of course, partially cleared, deforested, etc., but I don't think it was so distant in practice from much more primitive times. There were still huge forests, there were still communities that were essentially living out there, a bit, essentially isolated on their own. It wouldn't be even surprising if there had still been some sacks of paganism, of proper paganism, still in some, especially the forested areas. So this was a problem as far as the same imperial policy was concerned, because what the Habsburgs were trying to do, as we will see, wouldn't succeed, right? There was an attempt, of course, to extend a uniform rule, the dream of a national monarchy. The reform arrived, and this ruined the party for the universal program. The same is true for the 30 Years' War. The first phase was won by the Catholics, but then, as you know, the French, the Swedes arrived, so everything was much more, it was reversed, was thwarted again. And this mostly depended on the same Germans that opposed that degree of centralization, and losing, in this sense, an occasion, but also developing a bit of that specific federal mentality that still characterizes the contemporary people, and that is also, of course, responsible for some of the most important institutional, cultural, even artistic achievements as a consequence, right? Within Western civilization. It stems also from these struggles, from these bitter ones, for a stubbornness that you can identify even in these, again, sturdy pike squares that would make themselves slaughtered till the last drop of blood came out of your body while you were still alive. So the need for numerous armies, and above all standardized ones in interchangeable companies and regiments, became too great for the empire, right? And that was opposed in Germany, politically and socially, in the same way you can see in the semi-independent nature and mindset of the Landsknechts. This is crucial, again, because other states, as we've seen, Spain chiefly, or France, had other mentalities that were somehow more framed, or at least they had the resources to build up, to cement a kind of a more unitary policy, or something that at least would confer to armies a sort of I would say, of truly modern, at least fundamentals to develop further on them in something more permanent and uniformed and standardized. In Germany, this wouldn't happen. Landsknechts were an early, a precocious project, as we've seen, favored by the wake of this important late medieval German expansion, that, however, was in this sense still part of the previous cycle that was dying out, and that thus wouldn't make it to the next step of creating like a true permanent army, national army, that as the ones you see in the second half of the modern age, right? You would have, but it's not German. It's either Prussian or Austrian, it basically does not even encompass the majority of Germany as such. It draws peoples from everywhere, and especially doesn't rule over the entire country. Because, say, even the Dutch had only mercenaries in their army, but at least it was a truly Dutch army, right? Paid by and organized properly by the United Provinces and so on. And that's an interesting example of what we're talking about, because technically the Netherlands were part of the Holy Roman Empire. Instead, they basically seceded from it. Also, Switzerland basically did it in the end, but mostly due to its own isolation rather than what the Dutch did, literally rebelling to being the center of many powers and deciding to be just one among them, interestingly enough. Yet another people that started literally from nothing, and that managed to win that much that we know in today's Netherlands. The history of the leaders had also ended, right? The nature of war was still entrepreneurial, but it was also becoming somehow more, at higher levels, more institutionalized, at least in the most updated armies. Something you can see as late as, say, think about Wallenstein. We made a video about him some years ago. This is basically when at the end of the same, still at the end of the Landsknechts parabola, and the identity of the Landsknechts would die out, or it would be replaced by the one of standardized soldiery that was hired just at the moment, like in most armies, and maybe just forming around the imperial household at that point, rather than being this kind of larger, in theory, at least territorial force for the entire kingdom of Germany within the Holy Roman Empire. Thus, it's the prevalence of mercenarism and not the one of a kind of broader system or a statal army that would still take its time. In fact, in this regard, the Landsknechts have been also criticized by saying, comparatively, to the Spanish tercios, were, because at the time they were compared, in that sense, negatively, saying they were not like them. Well, it's true, but the tercio was like the gold standard, right? And considering the political and social background of the Landsknechts, they weren't actually doing that bad. They were pretty good troops for those time standards, and also because of this kind of sense of themselves within a context that was very different from the one of the Spanish crowns in that specific world. Bear it in mind. Again, if you don't have a truly unified country, or at least one like, again, Spain, that still is separated countries, but they're administered all together without too many troubles, you have an army that makes the interest of that specific polity, whereas in a country split in 300 states, well, already the fact that you have a force like the Landsknechts one is nothing short of a miracle, and plus they're even good at what they do. There was also a general decline, right? The imperial officers were greedy for greater profits, right? They managed, thus in the long run, to limit the power of the same union of the Landsknechts that, as we've seen, in some ways had procured even times in terms of representation. This was truly a military class that aimed at being part of the imperial estates, right, and diet and so on. And imperial officers preferred rather to pursue their own personal profit than paving the way for the promotion of their subordinates. And that is also understandable, against considering the limits politically and territorially of the Habsburgic rule. Of course, if the Habsburgs had managed to, say, crush the Reformation or somehow affirm their control all across Germany at large, they would have developed an army eventually comparable, say, to the one of Louis XIV. But again, Germany was not France. It should be pointed out that the Landsknechts also served abroad in other armies. We, for example, saw how many German mercenaries were at the service of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, not just in the forms of literal German subjects of the Poles, like Danzig, for example, but literal mercenaries, veterans from Germany, that some of them had been Landsknechts, or thus they still were by right, and that would sell their service abroad. We have seen the Black Band in French employ, so it's really normal. The economical crisis of the 16th century, the 17th too, on the one hand left the Landsknechts more and more often without pay, and on the other impoverished them after the day due to inflation, which eroded the purchasing power of the 4 florins, at which for a century their base penny had been fixed. This was true for the Habsburgic monarchy at large. The Austrian branch had a moment of difficulty between the end of the 16th and the early 17th century. The other German principalities were also compacting and supported by the Reformation that they had patronized, and so favoring that process of disgregation of what would have had to be on paper a universal empire like the HRE. So the old Landsknechts gradually died or retired. The new ones were selected with less rigor. It's yet another thing. And out of need, they adapted to that pay with ever more skimpy purchase value. So it wasn't about being that, cocky, arrogant, tough, brutal soldier that could even, bang his fists on the table by asking for more and, seizing what he couldn't get. They were just getting there for receiving a little pay that wasn't worth dying for anymore. This is important in general. Also, who are you really fighting for, and how disposed they are to help you pursuing your objectives. The Habsburgs had to cope with this massive schism in the West, and so in many ways they were just trying to pursue their own traditional goals without making too many favors to a class of mercenaries that mostly was fighting just for themselves and not for the universal order anymore, because it hadn't really been even particularly the case before. They had mostly looked at again their chances of autonomization or of full freedom, of independence, even against the hierarchy. So these two directions could not be reconciled, as you understand. Thus, the new Landsknechts would have never lived up to their predecessors, and above all, they would not have preserved the proud kind of class spirit with which they had opposed the abuses of their superiors. Already towards the mid-16th century, the prestige of the Landsknechts was, to say the least, obscured, also for many things that they had carried out, sinisterly. And then at the end of the century, the same term Landsknecht disappeared completely from views and from the official documents of the empire, in its administration, etc., being replaced by soldier. Pretty generically. The German mercenaries lost thus their self-awareness, their corporate feeling organized in proto-democratic forms, as we've seen. In other words, the adventure of the Landsknechts was over, right? Consumed not so much by battles and diseases, which also decimated them, but substantially by modernity and its needs in a world where the first uniforms were taking place, and there was no more space for the flamboyant and individualistic clothes of the Landsknechts themselves. Think from a psychological point of view what that means. Uniformity as the full victory of the ancien regime that manages to simply use this fantassin, equip them, armed them, and trained and kept under just as they please, like toy soldiers to send in the meat grinder, whereas the Landsknechts were still thinking to be kind of more like an actor in the scene. The first model wins because it's the civilizational one that has no it doesn't really look for favors to anyone. It's just based on pure rationale, discipline, and any interest in any other activity but power gaining. And the Landsknechts were, as we've seen, brutal, but as in this sense being part just from a background that could still, there was the fourth estate, but still hoping to maintain that kind of to increase its own autonomy as opposed to create a state, right, and ruling over a country as such, was eventually crushed by true modernity. I mean, the one that also in a positive sense makes armies and the success of civilizations and countries and nations and so on. So the Germans would have had to wait until the 19th century before that. And as we were saying before, there were also some dramatically obscure pages in the Landsknechts history. The first one is the sack of Rome, by importance. Right, 2 years after the Battle of Pavia, the Landsknechts were responsible, together with other mercenary forces, telling the truth, of the army of Charles V of Habsburg, in the sack of Rome. Charles V will justify that horrendous enterprise in his memoirs, stating that his main responsibility was not of his, but of those who had forced him to defend himself and to deploy such a large army that it proved difficult to control. Which, for all the enormous sympathy and admiration and interest I have historically for Charles V, sounds as a pretty lame answer from an emperor, meaning that, in other words, your army is, you're the emperor, you're supposed to be the greatest ruler in the world, and since just your enemies are too big, sorry, I lost control of their army and they sacked, the capital of Christendom. So, sorry about that, it's just this bastards. But, well, of course, they did so. But this naturally exemplifies the difficulties that the aforementioned model presented. They had armed a bunch of revolutionaries that it's just maybe excessive to frame just as such, because they were under part of nobility that was even fully Catholic. Many Landsknechts, as we'll see now, were Lutherans, so that they despised the Pope, etc. But telling the truth, the sack of Rome was much more ferociously perpetrated by the Catholic Spaniards than by the Lutheran Germans. But I guess that the chance makes the man thief in a way. So this was actually a huge tragedy, if anything, for how much Rome lost for universal civilization. The responsibility for so much mourning and devastation was, fell on Pope Clement VII, as we've seen. Charles was accusing him in that regard. And definitely this Pope wasn't a particularly, let's say he's been kind of vilified and demonized, but, considering the context, this has basically nothing to do with the sack of Rome per se, right? The only idea was the old thing of the Pope was guilty of having opposed imperial will, but if there is a Pope there, there is a reason, and in any case, doesn't matter how, unfaithfully he behaves towards the emperor, nobody really there was making a favor to anyone for that matter. Thus, Charles V said that it was to punish him that the emperor sent Landsknechts against him, because he couldn't even say that, as it did happen, that these men went out of his control, because that would have sounded even more lame for an emperor, because he couldn't say, I didn't do it. That was the imperial army, right? So the question is, do you want even to make it worse than it is? The forces were commanded by Georg von Frundsberg, as we've seen, who fought also in Pavia. And Frundsberg, who was wearing a golden rope tied to his horse's saddle, with which he said he wanted to hang the Pope himself, did not arrive in Rome because he suffered of a cerebral aneurysma, which forced him to return to his homeland in Tyrol, where he died eventually. An appropriate divine punishment. His troops arrived in front of Rome at the beginning of May of the year 1527, and on the 6th they started their assault on the urbs. And exasperated by the privations, by the missed payment, and with no one able to control them, the Landsknechts, largely Lutherans, even though under, as you understand, essentially a Catholic, or maybe just a crypto-Lutheran in some cases, officiality, and the other mercenaries devastated Rome, which was subjected to a loot that lasted 8 days. It's not so long, but it was very intense and ferocious, right? There were thousands dead. The city was heavily damaged, raped, stripped of her riches, and as if that weren't enough, made uninhabitable by plagues that broke out, as you understand it, among the armies often, but with all that amount of corpses rotting in the streets and all. So it was devastating. At that point, the city even risked to be attacked by sea by the Barbarossa, by the Ottoman privateer, but for some reason, because it was defenseless, right? Clement VII had managed to protect himself by shutting himself in Castel Sant'Angelo, which was an impregnable fortress, and that's kind of also interesting because there was a first attempt to attack it, but the papal troops managed to repel the assaults. By the way, the Swiss guard was cut right to the last man down in defending the papacy. This is clamorous, and it's very interesting to see that the Swiss mercenaries still exist today in the Vatican, and they, in fact, throughout all the modern and the contemporary era, kept providing guards to also the German princes, by the way, and that, in the sense, the Landsknechts that had successfully defeated them in open field, at the end of the day, disappeared, while still the Swiss services lived on in a way. That's kind of famous. But the last stand of the Swiss troops at the Vatican was one of the single most, magnificent acts of badassery in military history. The thing was bloody also for the assailants, by the way. There is the famous goldsmith, gunner, historian Benvenuto Cellini, who put in practice his mechanical intuitions by shooting the Germans and the Spaniards from Hadrian's tomb, that at that point had been reinforced with the most updated intuitions in military engineering of the Traces Italiennes, that I also made a video on, by the way. So this was really one of the most updated fortresses in Europe, right? And he shot in half with a falconet the Bourbon, right? The Duke of Bourbon, that, as you know, had betrayed Francis I. He had sided with the Protestants and the Spanish, the Germans, and had invaded Rome himself, and he died at the siege. In the meanwhile, the rest of the city was being ravaged, right? There were some heroic moments, like, even some noble women that managed to fortify within their villas, their palaces, saving lots of people from the street that were being sacked and so on. So it was a disaster anyhow, and it's one of the most famous pages in the history of the Landsknechts and of the Holy Roman Empire, first of all, but it also inflicted irreparable damage to the prestige and authority of the papacy as well. So showing this, again, with the Ottomans at the gates, the Reformation going on, like properly the moral shipwrecking of Europe in those terrifying times. Let's put it in this way. And so the proof of how distant from the ideal of Christian unity at that point the West had come, right, preferring to kill each other rather than fighting against the enemies of the faith, in a moment in which still crusades were pretty alive, and there were lots of peoples in, especially in the Balkans, in Central Europe, that were suffering of the Ottoman threat. And perhaps by divine punishment, but also actually mostly as an admonition, because the thing ended well, and we made a video about this recently. A couple of years later, it was Vienna, the Habsburgic capital, to be besieged by the Ottomans. And on that occasion, the siege failed, right? Because the season was particularly cold, even for Central European standards. At the beginning, it was at September, October, and the Landsknechts naturally were sent to counter the Ottoman army, and thus they kind of won the day, because at the end of the day the Ottomans were repelled. So it was thanks to these imperial forces, except at that point the Landsknechts took Vienna in hostage because they demanded their pay, and the alternative was sacking Vienna. They said that if they had not been paid, they would have done exactly what the Turks would have done if the city had fallen, because it was theirs now that they had saved her. This was the Landsknecht mentality, right? Something very far from saying, Christian solidarity or anything. They had their reasons, of course. And fortunately, also that massacre was averted. But as we've seen in Rome, the Landsknechts were capable of doing so as well. For the rest, we have, we can appreciate Landsknechts military history in other videos. We will surely make others in the future. Again, today it was just more like a broader introduction. The Landsknecht armies worked pretty much like the other armies of the time. During their campaigns, the Landsknechts were accompanied by a large retinue of civilians, saddler train, mainly composed of the wives and children of the soldiers. In some of the stamps that I uploaded here, you see there is even a Landsknecht with a child of his that is, equipped like a little Landsknecht. It is very cute in that regard. There were also some merchants. These people marched with the baggage train and were collectively referred to as Tross, right? While the Hohenweibel, that is to say, literally the whore sergeant, was the regimental officer in charge of them, which is quite interesting. This thing of the prostitutes is fascinating because, first of all, this was true in any army. Like, even papal armies had properly attacks on the soldiers in the army for maintaining women with them. And there are many romantic, albeit tragic, stories behind this, because you cannot fail to see a continuity in even some legitimate love affairs between, again, the soldiery and their wives, right? Some of them were literally like just the moral equivalent of the soldiers. They literally survived in these camps. They had, say, a husband for 3 years, then they had another one. Also, because considered that these men died frequently. But the idea is that there was some idea, first of all, of retinue, the idea of family. Just think about the ancient Germanic, Teutonic and Cimbrian women that were marching in this migration together with the army, and that killed themselves once their warriors had died in battle before the Romans arrived to enslave them. This was a bit the same idea. The fact that, according to the traditional ideology, the woman basically finds her fulfillment with and under the man, and thus becoming one. And so when the man dies, her purity is lost, and her chance of transfiguration in that holy communion ends. So she kills herself to prove she's up to her husband's role. It's the same reason. Just the other day we talked about Vedic India. It's the same reason why they kill women, when their husbands die, right? In a very different kind of formalistic ritual sense than what was instead willingly searched for by not necessarily these women in the 16th century, but at least, again, to universal tradition in the past millennia. But again, the idea that the woman would be also a pretty tough one, following her husband or her lover, whatever, in these enterprises is deeper anthropologically than we think, right? We just say these are a bunch of harlots, but it's not true, right? It's something much deeper. Of course, it was full of prostitutes in a truly, say, professional business sense, but there was much more to it, and in this sense, the German legacy may be truly connected with that older kind of not fully secularized and modernized reality that comparatively with the other countries we could find. And especially considering that the Landsknechts, again, were free. You don't find this freedom in other countries. Say, Poland didn't have this core of free men, if not in the nobility, right? In the hussars, especially in this Central European reality, which is very feudal, right? It was even prestigious, as we've seen, to be a free man in arms, because nobody was free normally, and thus you can imagine these women even being fascinated by the same opportunity that these men represented for them, in all sense. Of course, the women and the boys made themselves useful by providing various services, such as cooking, helping to set up the camp, assisting the wounded, preparing and cleaning the latrines. Well, the merchants are obviously there because they, like in all armies, they had the money with them, and they could buy the loot, which was thus immediately monetized from the Landsknecht side, and sell it somewhere else. So it was really normal. And the merchants, of course, were also subcontracted the logistical services, the supplies, and so on. So, of course, there were lots of field aids of this, technically civilians, after the mercenary army. the phenomenon of accompanying families could, in a sense, detract from the military efficiency of the unit. You know that in the past, say, in the Roman army, was forbidden at a point, but it was very difficult also to prevent. First of all, because say it added many mouths to feed, right? And some recruitment contracts specified that a Landsknecht could not bring more than one woman with him. So this was aimed also at preventing that, like a Landsknecht could, for example, become like a pimp in a way, that so that he could become richer than the others by exploiting maybe some women, and aggrandizing his against that kind of egalitarianism that the Landsknechts search for themselves. They had all to be somehow equal, so they could have a woman as their wife/mistress, but they couldn't capitalize upon, at least putting a strain on also the army supplies, etc., by having more people there. And there are very interesting also literary passages, of course, documenting these men's lives, as we've seen songs. These legacy was revisited even in, say, in the 19th century, in the 20th century, even in a national socialistic sense, because, again, it was thought that these men retrospectively were sort of kind of statalistic, collectivistic anticipation of the of the people, say the fourth estaters, that would take over the world later after the disgregation of tradition. They were, let's say, closer to that than it seems, because of course their extraction would make them so, but the context is also much more complicated than that. And of course, we can be fascinated legitimately with the Landsknechts reality, but we also have to make an effort in understanding it. And I think especially this sense of transposition of political autonomy within a imperial, so technically public military service, universal military service, is one of the single most underappreciated aspects of the Landsknechtry, because you don't really find any other. That said, you can find, yes, the ideal of the citizen soldier, that especially humanism was resuming, and so on, but you have to look at the reality that was the farthest from that had not even technically existed in the time of the Romans or the Greeks, and that thus was somehow idealized still today, especially in understanding that you cannot have a successful army if you don't have this level of collective discipline that you have seen is necessary properly to advance from a military point of view and civilizationally, so through a state, an order, an authority, but also an aptness to fight. So mental, physical fitness, the idea of coming from a background where you must hate, you must be motivated by a nightmarish reality, by a purpose that makes you virtuous in the kind of warrior sense, so that without this combination you cannot have you cannot be right in the first place. And in fact, I think it's atrociously disgusting how people buy the concept of warriorism today, and they completely miss, of course, the most important part, which is instead the one of collective training, without which warriors are, as history has proven very clearly, slaughtered without any chance of, say, or even being remembered having existed, and legitimately so, because, if you fail in the activity in which you should be the master of, like you are, that's what you deserve, and that's literally what they believed in themselves. So it's very important also to see the relation between the German nobility and the Landsknechts, and especially in a more accurate history of Germany during those years, which is extremely complicated. And perhaps we could start some modern history lesson series, because It seems, of course, without context, it's always more difficult to talk straight about such complicated, such complex, at least, topics. In any case, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.